Thanks for coming. My name is Burt Beckwith, and this is a discussion of what's new in the rewritten, redesigned, refactored, shiny new Spring Security Core 2.0 plugin. And I apologize in advance, but I have almost no jokes for this talk, so it won't be very funny. All right. So once again, like I said, I work for a very cool company in Boston called Cantina. We do lots of, we do pretty much everything you would want from anyone. We do front-end work, back-end work, all kinds of cool stuff. So once again, the beautiful scenery of Boston. Okay, so before we talk about what's new, let's talk just about, in general, sort of an introduction of what's old. What's already there in Spring Security. So it is a Grailsy wrapper around Spring Security. Ideally, it makes security a lot easier to use. And Spring Security, it has a reputation for being difficult to work with. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the first two project maintainers were PhDs. And so it's very big and complex and powerful, but somewhat hard to use. And of course, in the Grails space and in the Java space in general, we have a very strong competitor to Spring Security, Shiro. And Shiro has always been described as sort of the Mac versus the Spring Security being Windows, right? So they're both very capable, but you know, they are differently focused. So what I've always tried to do with everything I've done with Spring Security is make Spring Security as easy as possible, as comfortable as possible to work with. So that's been my goal. So along those lines, what I've always tried to do is make sure that it's as easy as possible to customize. So dozens of, maybe even, depending on how you configure things, you can have 50 or more Spring beans that are created. So I want to make sure that if you need to change some piece of functionality, that there's a property you can set, or you can redefine the bean, but you shouldn't have to really work hard at changing one small thing, which I think you do kind of have to do in regular Spring Security because of the way that things are configured with the XML configuration. Now there is the Java config, but even still, some things that you would think would be relatively straightforward to do are, you have to write a bean post-processor sometimes, and it can be a lot of work. So I just want to make it really easy to make small changes and easy to make big changes. So from the outset, it's been designed to be customized and extended. So hopefully it's easy to get started. You just install the plugin, which nowadays means you add a dependency and build config.groovy, run Grails compile to make sure it resolves, and then run the S2 quick start script. So that has a couple of different options that you can use. Creates the domain classes that you would use for your user and role class. It configures, sets up some settings in config.groovy, and once you've done that, you've got a basic set of functionality, and then you can customize from there. So there's a bunch of helper classes. You've got Spring Security Service, the Spring Security Utils, there's a taglib class with a bunch of tags in there, there's the controllers, all that stuff. So a lot of stuff to just kind of get you working very, very quickly. So out of the box, without any external extension plugins, you get form-based authentication, username, password, the standard thing. HTTP basic auth is there, and so is digest auth. And digest auth doesn't get discussed all that often. It's a little bit better than HTTP basic. They're both still bad because you really, if you're going in that direction, you really want to use an OAuth type of a solution. But digest fixes a few of the issues with HTTP basic. So you get users and roles. There's the concept of hierarchical roles, which can make things simple. So for example, if you naively set up a user role and an admin role and maybe a super admin role, and then you annotate a controller action that says that this requires role user. Well, out of the box, an admin can't access that page because the admin might not be granted a user role. But so what you can do then is you can assign all the admins user role and the admin role, or you can define that the admin role basically extends from the user role. And so those are hierarchical. You can create a graph, a tree of roles. That makes things a little bit more dry. And there's also we'll see in a bit that there's a new at authorities annotation that does the same sort of thing. And there's an even newer feature that isn't available in the current release of the plugin that was user contributed a month or more ago for role groups. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can, if you have a very complex collection of roles and relationships between them, there are a few different ways that you can organize those and keep them easy to work with. And you don't have to use domain classes. You don't have to store data in the database. That's completely decoupled in Spring Security and also in the plugin. And everything goes through this user detail service. This is an interface that can be implemented out of the box. You do get GORM domain classes. You do go to the domain to GORM. If you're using Hibernate, it goes to Hibernate. If you're using Mongo, it goes to Mongo. But you can get the user and role and whether the user's locked or enabled or their password's expired. All that data can come from literally anywhere. All you have to do is define the user detail service, and you're good to go. And it's such an important concept in the plugin that there's an entire section of the documentation that describes that. So lots of options for hashing passwords. Contrary to what I said yesterday, you should never store passwords in clear text in the database. You should always hash them. Before in the older plugin, the default was SHA-256, which is pretty good. You definitely don't want to use a lot of the older, easily hacked hashing options, like MD5 would be terrible. And even SHA-256 is becoming really ineffective because as hackers are using GPUs and really fast processors, it's very easy to try millions of combinations of passwords very quickly and using rainbow tables and lookup tables, things like that. So you really want to use the strongest password hashing options that are available. So out of the box right now, well, I'm not going to talk about what's now, I'm talking about what's old. So there are many different ways you can hash your passwords. And also, of course, using Assault, which is pretty much always a good idea. So there's Remember Me, so you don't have to authenticate every single time you check the checkbox, and it sets a cookie and then it lasts for whatever, how long, 14 days, a week, whatever. Question?
Do you want us to ask questions later? Or,
Sure, ask questions whenever you like.
okay. I have a question about consulting and migrating to Is there a way inside Spring Security to migrate from one strategy to a better one?
That is an excellent question. So the question is there a way inside of the plugin or inside of the Spring Security, having used one salting mechanism, to switch to the new one? And there is. Well, there isn't, but I wrote a blog post on this. So if you go to my, I will add a link to that blog post to the notes before I upload them to SlideShare. Or you can just look at my blog, burtbeckwith.com/blog. And it's a few posts back. And it's for exactly that reason, because the old plugin defaulted to SHA-256. The new plugin defaults to bcrypt. You can switch it back to use SHA-256 so everything still works. But what you should do is use the strongest, best approach. So I'll add that. There is support for AJAX, so that you don't have to always go to a login form. You can have a JavaScript event where you click a link and it pops up a little modal dialog, and you can authenticate and then not have to reload the entire page to authenticate. So that's baked into the plugin. Switch user, so like sudo in Linux or Unix. So you can configure that, and you want to of course guard this, but you can set up a feature where an admin, for example, can impersonate a user without having to know their password. So they can run as this user temporarily, do some things, and then switch back to themselves. So that's very easy to use. Channel security is a good thing. So if you have subsets of your application that require HTTP or require HTTPS, there's a built-in feature to redirect. Session fixation protection is a really good feature. So what that does is it guards against a scenario, XSS, CSRF sort of an attack where you get I craft a URL with the JSession ID, for example, and then somehow get you to click it. Maybe it's a URL in a comment section on a blog or something, or I send it to you email or whatever, and so because it has the session ID in the URL, you're going to use my session. We're going to share a session. And then when you authenticate, now I'm authenticated as you because we're sharing the same session, and I can do terrible things having logged in through you. So what session fixation protection does is when you authenticate, if this is enabled, it creates a new session, copies over all the session variables into it, and you don't see anything as a user. Nothing really changes. It's a very quick thing to do. But then in that scenario, I will keep my old session as the hacker. You get your new session, and then we're separate, and there's no risk there. So that's a very good feature. So this is an old slide. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but this is a slide from the Spring Security docs. So there's a lot of cool stuff under the hood there that's still there. This is another really old slide that is intentionally hard to read because it's just a very long laundry list of stuff that's there. So lots of cool stuff going on inside of the plugin. And of course, there's the extension plugin. So like I said, there's those 3 authentication mechanisms that you get out of the box. But there's the ACL plugin for fine-grained control over individual objects. Instead of just guarding URLs, you can guard objects. There's the CAS single sign-on plugin, LDAP OpenID, the UI plugin, all those other ones. And those are the ones that I've done. And there's also the extension plugins that other developers have created. Like there's a Twitter login plugin, there's a Facebook plugin. There's a bunch of them. So there's almost as many plugins that I didn't write as that I did write. So it's been kind of cool that other people have jumped in and have extended this platform, basically. So it's a plugin that accepts other plugins. And there's a bunch of other stuff, too, that we just don't have time to go into. So having said all that, what is new? So there is a What's New in version 2.0 page in the documentation. If you follow that link, you'll see that. And I've been updating that as I add more features. D2, I've made a bunch of fixes and added a few new features. So there are some things that aren't available yet. I will likely do, because it's been taking altogether too long to get this out, I'll probably do an RC3 release, which will really be a proper release candidate. It'll pretty much be a true release candidate in the sense that I hope nothing changes from RC3 to the final. But because it's been months since RC2 was out and I've made a bunch of changes and fixes, I want to make sure that everything works, I didn't break anything, and then after people have used it for a little while, then I'll do the final release. So the big changes in 2.0 are here. So the default in the old SCG plugin and in the Spring Security plugin that I created that replaced the SCG plugin was the assumption that most of the site is open and there's maybe an admin section and there's probably a section where you to authenticate. So take, for example, Amazon.com or any sort of shopping site. So you go there and you can browse the site and you can see the products. You can do a lot of stuff. But then in order to see your order history or in order to actually make a purchase, you need to authenticate it yourself, and then you can see just your stuff. And then one would assume that there's an admin section of the application that regular users can't get to that's guarded for admins. So the default is that it's open by default and that you have to lock down the user stuff to be specific to that user, and the admin sections have to be guarded to be only admin access. And the problem with that approach is that it's too easy to forget to block access to something. So you add in a new controller for an admin, and that, the admin group requests a new feature, so you create a new action or a new controller, and you forget to annotate that with @secured role admin. And they say, thanks for the new feature, they can use it because it's open to the world, and no one notices for a long time that anyone can get to that new thing. So what we should be doing instead is locking down access to everything and requiring that you open up access to everything. So in the scenario that I just described, we add in this new feature for the admins, we forget to say admins can access this, and then we tell the admins, hey, check out the new thing that you asked us to do, and they say we can't get to it, we're blocked. All right. So that's going to fail very quickly. The other scenario is it's going to fail very slowly and in a very, very bad way. So everything's locked down by default. You have to open it up. And so it's been annoying. It's been frustrating for people. A lot of people don't like that. So you don't have to do this. You can use the old approach. And in fact, I document in the plugin how to open it up so it uses the other model. But what I want to make sure is that it is aggressively secure. It's annoyingly secure. You have to open up bugs. You have to create the bugs. It's not my fault if you get hacked. I don't want you to sue me. It's your fault. So this is that pessimistic lockdown concept. And there's those two properties that configure it, and that's all described in the documentation. So when you run the S2 quick start script, you get the domain classes, and this block is added to the config.ruby for you. And what this does is it opens up access to images and CSS and JavaScript and the favicon and the index page and all that sort of stuff. So these are sort of the sensible defaults for things that should be globally accessible, typically, of course, and then you can then remove this or modify this. But this basically gives you, because it's fairly unlikely that you're going to want to block access to CSS files, right? Although you may want to block access to the admin's JavaScript, for example. So, yes?
Can I run anything with the word images is insecure?
Yes. So that means if you have a controller that is in a namespace images, that will open that up. So, this isn't required. You can edit this. You can change that. You could also change it to star.gif and star.jpg and star.ping. This is just a suggested starter configuration. So that's if you're using annotations for guarding access, right? There's three ways that you can guard access. There's annotations, there's request maps in the database, which are nice for if you have requirements that you need to be able to change rules while the app is running, or add in new rules, or remove access, whatever you want to do. If you need that dynamicness, then you can store the rules in the database and then use an admin tool to change those rules. And then the third way is just basically a big map. So this is what you get by default in config.ruby. And in the documentation, I describe a suggested approach for creating the analogous rules with request maps. You can just use those same patterns and then loop through them and do this in bootstrap.ruby. And then here's a starter intercept URL map if you're using that big map approach. And in this case, you actually have to notice that you have to have a rule for the login and the logout controllers, because the login and the logout controllers are annotated. But if you're not using annotations, then those would be ignored. And so you have to, in this case, actually have a rule for that. So this isn't created in config.ruby, but this is in the documentation. So you can just copy and paste that. So logout now requires post. You can turn that off. You can allow logout through get. But the reason that you should use post for logout is that someone could create a link. Because if you can use a get request to log out, then I can create a link that logs you out. That's not a big deal, because you can always log back in again. But if you have to post to log out, then it's slightly more secure. So the default password hashing approach is now bcrypt, which is very strong and very good. And the biggest benefit of bcrypt, slow. That's a good thing. For you to log in, it's going to take longer to compute the hash than it would if you were using a more lightweight approach. But it's not 10 seconds. I mean, it's hundreds of milliseconds or tens of milliseconds. But you can choose how slow it is. So what this helps with is brute force attacks. If it takes a hacker half of a second to compute every password, then it's going to be very slow for them to try millions of combinations. So you can choose how slow bcrypt is. There's another one, PBKDF2, which is very similar to bcrypt. It's apparently, I'm not a security expert by any stretch, but from what I've read, it's very similar and better for some reasons. I suggest that you do your own research on why that might be. But either of those is available, and there's another one called scrypt, that I wrote myself a bug to implement script also, so that you can choose any of these really strong ones. And you can, of course, still use MD5 if you really need to, and you can use SHA-256, SHA-512. Any of the hashing algorithms that are available in the JVM can be used. The session fixation prevention that I was talking about earlier is used to be default to false, and you had to turn it on. Now it's on, and you have to turn it off if you don't want that. So when I first started this refactoring, I was working with Spring Security 3.1. So the 1.2 plugin is using 3.07. Originally, when I started doing this refactoring, I switched to 3.1, and then 3.2 came out, and then 3.2.1 and 2, and literally this week, Wednesday, I think, 3.2.3 was released. So now the plugin uses 3.2.3. So it'll always use the latest and greatest Spring Security under the hood. So one of the big changes internally, and this affects you if you're doing the customization, if you're creating your own replacement classes, if you're overriding beans and creating plugins, is that internally every package changed. So there were two sets of packages. There was the Grails plugins with an s.springsecurity. Whatever, and then there was the org codehouse Grails Groovy blah 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 package set. Everything now is under Grails.plugin.springsecurity, and further, the sub-packages underneath that they correspond to the same packages in Spring Security itself to keep, to make everything sort of, instead of having basically one big package like it was, group them intelligently. So for example, GORM user detail service goes under the user details sub-package, and the AJAX aware access denied handler is under web.access, just like the class that it extends is in the Spring Security web.access package. So, along the same lines, the configuration settings always have the prefix in 1.2 anyway, grails.plugins.springsecurity.whatever, and those all start with grails.plugin.springsecurity. And what that means is that if you don't change your settings, then they'll get ignored. But there is a warning that you'll see that you could possibly miss. But when the plugin starts up, it actually looks for, are you using grails.plugins.springsecurity settings, and it'll tell you, hey, don't do that. You have to switch these. There is no longer any HQL in the plugin. I'm a big fan of HQL. I've done a lot of SQL programming, so HQL for me is very natural. I still struggle with criteria queries. It's just my brain is damaged in that way, and I just I've tried so many times to just say, you're smart, you can do this, let's write some criteria queries, and then I just try to do it and I fail. So I always go back to HQL queries. The where queries, the new where queries are great. Those make sense to me. But HQL is a problem because it only works in Hibernate, it only works with a relational database, and if you're using Mongo or any other non-Hibernate, non-relational database data store, HQL doesn't work. So none of the queries in the core plugin use HQL. They all use where queries and criteria queries. And that's also true in all of the other plugins. The exception is the UI plugin. And there are a bunch of searching queries that are very complex because there's a dynamic search page where you choose a bunch of options and then it builds up the search query. And that's just, we could convert that to criteria queries, and if someone wants to do that, that'd be great. I'm not willing to do that work. I don't think it's worth the effort from me. But if anybody wants to do that, I don't have any need to use HQL there. It's just work that I don't want to have to do. Okay, so there are even more configurable properties. I noticed several that I had missed. So, and I'm shooting for 100%. I'm shooting for every Spring Bean that's created. I never use a default value. I always set up a property in the properties file and then set the value to its default value, the setting, easily. So hopefully everything is configurable. One of the things that I've also done, and this is really more for, this doesn't affect general usage, it's more for if you're writing customized beans or plugins, is if something's private or package scope, then depending on how it yes, in Groovy we can access private fields, but we can't access private classes unless we really jump through some hoops. And for example, I'm going to pick on the Spring team for a bit, but when I did the work on the initial work on the cache plugins, the Grails cache plugins, so they added the caching APIs and a few implementations. So you can use the Hcache and various underlying providers, and there's a common API across those. And the implementations were very frustrating because they're very proper object-oriented. So there's a lot of encapsulation, there's a lot of private variables. Anything that shouldn't be exposed isn't. There's a lot of package scope classes. So what I had to literally do was copy and paste a whole class over to the Grails code base just so I could change one thing. And that was very frustrating. And so what I've done is I've tried to make sure that nothing is private. Even stuff that really should be private isn't, so that you can always change the value. So I'm trying to make sure that the minimum visibility is protected. So I was being a bit of a wanker using with transaction in a couple places. You should pretty much never use with transaction, right? It's kind of a hack. If you're doing something transactionally, it should be inside of a service that's transactional. So instead of doing that, I'm using @transactional, so I'm doing a proper transaction. So get current user is a weird thing. It's a bit misused. Let me talk about that in a second. But so originally what it did was it assumed that the principal, which is the data object that represents who you are, is a Grails user, which extends the Spring Security user. And what I do there is I cache the ID of the domain object that was loaded to populate the username, the password, and the roles and all that stuff. And then I can easily just to reload that user instance back from the database, I can just call get. It's very efficient, right? Because get by ID it's very intelligently cached by Hibernate, and you're working with the primary key, so it's going to be fast. There's an index on the primary key. But that's problematic if you're not using a Grails user. If you have a different implementation, if you've rewritten if you have your own user detail service, and you're, for example, if you're using LDAP or Kerberos or the REST plugin, then it's not necessarily going to be a Grails user. So now what it does is it actually checks to see if it's an instance of Grails user, and it does a get by ID. Otherwise, it does a find where on the username. And of course, the username property name is dynamic, so I have to do that reflectively. But basically, it just does find user where username equals whatever. And that should also be just about as efficient as a get, because it's fairly likely that the username will have a unique index on it. So that should cover most cases. Yes, sir.
So the find where is called the domain class, the user domain class, right?
It does. It looks up the user class, and
Have you ever considered replacing that dependency from core to different supply control? Because in the day, there's a dependency to core.
Right, of course.
So once you send that, for instance, you will end up with a role in the database for that particular user.
Yeah, of course. We have to talk more in detail about that. This may be me being lazy and cheating a bit, but you don't have to use this method.
Yeah.
This is an optional method. It's a helpful utility thing. The plugin never uses it itself. This is only for your benefit. So, and all it does is it looks up the registered class name of the user class. It doesn't make any presumptions of that. It could be user or sec user or person, whatever you called it. And it does a get or it does a find where, it does a gorm lookup, using either the ID or the username. You can do that yourself. You can get the currently logged in user information, the principal data, and use whatever you used to originally get the data in the first place to reload that data. So I don't think that's that much of a, I don't know. We will talk about this. It's on my to-do list. Now, along those same lines, this method gets, I think, misused a little bit. And quite often, I've seen in Stack Overflow and questions on the mailing list where people are loading the whole user object from the database just to get something that was already available in memory. So, Or, for an example like this, to basically use the user object as a foreign key. So now there's a new load current user method, which uses the, and of course this is a primarily a Hibernate thing, but it's going to load the user and create a proxy instead of actually going to the database. And load just basically stores the ID in the object, and first time you call any property, access any property other than the ID, then it actually goes to the database. But in a case like this, all you need is the ID, because the ID is going to be used as a foreign key. So people won't probably use this a lot, but I wanted to make this available. So, and I'm going to try to make sure that it's clear in the documentation that this is available. So, another optimization, something that Graham did a while ago in Grails that I thought was a great idea. Filling in the stack trace is insanely expensive. And if you don't need it, it's a bad thing to do. So there's a method, fill in stack trace, where it does all that work. But you can override that and do nothing. So now when a username, when a user isn't found, a user exception is thrown. Since you probably don't care where the stack happened because you know where it happened, it happened during login, I'm going to throw this exception, which is very lightweight, and it's not going to incur all that cost. There's this cool new authorities annotation. I wrote a blog post about this a while ago, and so now this is a part of the plugin. That's what I was talking about earlier, where there are all those different ways to if you have a really large number of interrelated roles, to group them intelligently. So some changes with guarding URLs. @secured only works with controller methods. Just me being lazy, I don't want to do the work to support using closures and controllers because you shouldn't be using closures and controllers anymore. Grails 2 supports closures or methods, but of course methods make a lot more sense, so I'm just being a little bit lazy there. You can actually define a closure, which is Groovy code, that will run as the check to see are you allowed to access this URL. So you can do arbitrarily complex Groovy code and plug that in and use that check. So, and this is kind of silly, but I'm just showing that the request and the CTX variable is the Spring application context. So you should have a lot of information available to you. You've got the request, you can get to the session if you needed to, you can go to call any Spring beans, you've got the authentication object. So you've got a lot of things there that you can use to do very complex, very custom checks. And the alternative to that is, of course, the Spring SPEL, Spring Expression Language, which is very powerful. But it's a little weird, and we're Groovy developers, so we should be able to use Groovy if we need to. You can also specify the HTTP verb, which is something that's been supported in Spring Security itself, but it wasn't supported in the plugin. So if you have different rules for get versus put versus delete versus post and all that, you can now say that this is secured one way for post and a different way for get. Something that's really been annoying about Spring Security is that if you're anonymous, so this is an optional feature that's enabled in the plugin. So basically what it does is if you're not logged in, it creates a fake sort of a dummy authentication object so that you don't have to do a null check. But the principal object is actually a string, so you've got to do this instance of, it's polymorphic. It's either user details if you're really logged in or it's a string if you're not. That's really silly. So what I did was I created I changed it all around so that there's always a user details. But if you're anonymous, then you're not a real person. You're not really logged in. You just have role anonymous, and you just never grant role anonymous to anything. They can never do anything. So it works exactly the same way. It's just more consistent. You don't have to do these silly instance of checks. Several users contributed translations in lots of cool new languages. So there were several before. Now there are even more. Controllers and GSPs are no longer generated into your code base during the S2 quick start script. So all you get is the changes to config.groovy and the domain classes, and the controllers and the GSPs are in the plugin itself. You can still customize them. If you wanted to change the look and feel, you can still do that. You just have to copy the controller or the GSP or whatever you want to change into your application and then edit that. Because remember that because of the order of compilation, Grails compiles plugins first, and then the application. So the application always wins. It always takes precedence. So there were a couple bugs that were reported that the plugin didn't work for Grails 2.3. So there's this cool new redirect mapping that you can set up in URL mappings. That wasn't working, so that's been fixed. Annotating a RESTful controller or a class that extends, a controller that extends RESTful controller wasn't working. That's been fixed. I was a bad boy and I was using application holder in one place in the plugin, and that was deprecated, but still working, and it's gone in 2.4, yay. So I switched that to use holders. That's not in the current version of the plugin, but that's in the code, and that'll be available in RC3. This is a cool thing. It's not a super big deal, but Spring Security 3.2 added this debug filter that prints out a bunch of useful information. It's really best for during development. So it's package default, so guess what I had to do? I had to copy and paste. I copied their thing, and it's basically the same code. It's just now it's in my code base and theirs. So you can enable that very easily. Please only do that in the development environment. Role groups, like I said, this is a really cool thing. It's a big contribution. So it was a lot of code, a lot of changes. So the way that you can use role groups now is that you say, the old way you would do it was Grails S2 quick start, package name, user class name, role class name, optionally the request map class name if you want to use request maps. But now you can say -- group class name equals whatever you want to call it, role group, or you can use whatever name you like. And this will create a whole bunch of stuff. So it'll add in some properties into config.groovy, and it'll create 3 domain classes. So the role group class, and then the 2 many-to-many classes. So this is a pretty big topic. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this is all described in the documentation. And it changes the user class. So instead of getting a set of roles back, you get a set of role groups back, which are then composed of multiple roles. And internally in the plugin, when you go to log in, all that gets expanded out. Those are links to the documentation for those new classes, which aren't live yet, but will be soon. So some miscellaneous stuff. So I had used a bcrypt implementation that I found online. So now there's actually bcrypt support in Spring Security itself, so I'm using their implementation instead of the one that I had found online. Granted authority impulse is still there, but it's deprecated, so you want to be using simple granted authority if you access that directly. We went back and forth on this, and I do not remember why we ended up setting up WebXML as provided. There was a big mess because Spring Security and the resources plugin both use the WebXML plugin because we reorder the filters and do all this stuff, and for some reason we had to use provided, and I don't know. So I just switched it so it's compile. The problem with provided is that you need a secondary resolve, and it would cause all these strange problems. So now it's just compile scope, and it just works, and don't worry about it. And who cares, because no one's going to be using the resources plugin anyway, because you're going to use asset pipeline, right? You're going to start, if you haven't started migrating, start tomorrow. The plugin only works with Grails 2.0 because why would you use anything other than Grails 2.0? I'm still shocked when I hear people are using 1.2 and 1.3. This is really tiny, but a small thing. So the property, when in the user class, the enabled property is defaults to true in the domain class itself. So there's one less thing you have to do when you create a new user in bootstrap.groovy. We had a complaint that the plugin was a little noisy. It prints out the configuring messages. So you can turn that off now if you want a nice clean output. This is a weird thing. So there was a default setting for the user domain class name. It was set to person, and all these classes, all these properties had a silly default setting. So what would happen is if you were misconfigured, you'd get this very strange exception saying the person class was not found, and then if you had defined it to be sec user, then it would be very confusing. Why are you complaining about this person class that I don't know anything about? So now there are no default values for these things. You have to set them, and so you get a much more helpful error message. Another really tiny little thing. The authentication details source isn't configurable, so I made it configurable, and this is all described in the documentation. The security context holder is the way that the authentication object is made available. So it uses a thread local, so that it's always available. But if you create a new thread, it's thread local, so it's not going to be available in the new thread. So you can change that to be an inheritable thread local, so that the threads that are spawned from other threads inherit the thread local. And you can also define your own strategy if you like, so that's all configurable. Another small thing, when you logged in, it used to store the last username, and it used to also HTML escape it. So now they don't do that, and if you need that functionality for whatever reason, then you turn that back on. This doesn't affect you at all, but I had a blast converting all the functional tests from the functional test plugin to using Jeb. Jeb's awesome, and it was really fun for me, and so now the tests just make a lot more sense, and I strongly encourage you, if you haven't used Jeb for functional testing, to jump right on it, because it's very, very, very cool. If you want it, the old 1x code is in its own branch. So there may be, if there's a huge, I'm not going to do any more releases intentionally for the 1.2 branch, but if there's some sort of huge security thing, then I'll do another release of the 1.2 plugin. I'm not going to go through all these details, but I just wanted to have kind of a list somewhere of new properties. So there's a whole bunch of new properties, and these are all described in the docs. So there's actually 3 pages of new properties. There's a bunch that were changed. So these are the ones, rejected for no rule. That's that pessimistic lockdown. SHA-256 was changed to bcrypt, and so that's all the changed config properties. And then there were a handful that didn't make any sense anymore, so those are gone. So what's left to do? A lot. This is actually not true. I fixed 3 whole bugs this morning. Well, I fixed 2, and one of them turned out to be a duplicate. So now I'm down to 28. Luckily, a small handful of those are sort of big and will take some time. Most of them are nice to haves that may get pushed to a 2.01 release, 2.02. But yeah, I've definitely got some work to do. Nothing serious. I think the current plugin is pretty stable. People are using it in production, I think. But I know that everyone would be a lot more comfortable having an official 2.0 release, and I would love to get that out the door myself, because it's been a long time. So a lot of work. Okay, so buy this book and use that code. Gracias.